Hey there. Thanks for tuning in today for another episode. Today, I want to talk about good AI and bad AI, really everything in the artificial intelligence space, which really taking over all of not just like technology itself the past couple years, but multiple industries beyond that as well. And just really talk about how AI can be best applied and where it's sort of faltering, I think, in many different areas. And I want to start with really the key focus of when you need to implement AI at all. Now, I want to start here because I think the most important thing to recognize is that, yes, in this industry, especially in technology, AI is just the absolute bee's knees, as it were, and it's just everyone is trying to build into this space. And so if you are a seed series startup or just looking for your first funding, or maybe even just trying to go for funding in general, you've already raised some, in many areas now, you just have to have an AI story. You have to have an AI implementation. And I feel that in many times is sort of undercutting really great experiences, great value, because people are forcing in AI experiences where maybe they don't need to be. And it's leading to really bad overall implementations. And it's frustrating because of two things. One, I don't believe that just because the industry needs AI, that you have to force it in an inorganic way and just to be able to say something. I think there's so much that can be accomplished with these great new tools and implementations that you don't have to have a bad sort of solution set. But beyond that as well, what you also need to look at is ultimately, if you're going to have to include AI in your product and in your space, you need to sort of understand what is that vision of how it connects long term with what it is you're trying to do as a company. And is it simply this add on that doesn't provide value but provides cachet for new investors, but at the end of the day is really just going to be driving you as a company into the wrong direction as a whole. And so, with that sort of set to the side, recognizing that there are situations where you sort of have to force AI in unfortunate terms, let's talk about how you can at least build good solutions. And if you have to force it in, how you can do that. But if in the hopefully good sense you don't have to force it in, how you can best leverage it going forward. And let's start with maybe what's like some of the best AI. The easiest one to sort of start with is ChatGPT. And ChatGPT is great for a few reasons. Now, one of the things you may think at is, oh, it has the best model. Well, in many ways it does. Not in all situations. Certainly not the best coding model out there. If you haven't used Claude's or Anthropic's 3.5, very far better. But ChatGPT is great for so many situations. It's a phenomenal model, of course. For 4.0, the O1 preview is just phenomenal in many different areas. And on top of this, what we can also see is there's just a great experience, in many ways paralleling the experience that Google first presented when it came out. Just having this very simple search bar, ChatGPT does much of the same. It's just a simple text box that you can write whatever your questions are. And as people have gotten more used to prompting and leveraging ChatGPT, they have a better understanding of how to actually leverage ChatGPT's prompting in the best ways and getting the best results. Very similar to how Google's own sort of growth happened and people got better at knowing the right ways to search. Although some might say there's still a lot to be learned there. But ChatGPT is ultimately great because, again, it's simple, it brings a great experience, and solves for the problems that people are actively looking for in the ways that they're striving to get those answers. People are leveraging these LLMs because, they have a great way of asking a question, have an organic response back and forth, where you're sort of having that conversation. And that's why the LLM is great. And that is why having this back and forth prompt scenario where you can learn and it can sort of remember what you've talked about previously are sort of these new solutions that just bring a great experience for learning and engaging. I recall the very first time I recognized ChatGPT might overtake Google in some ways or in many sort of different approaches was when I recognized that I had a question I couldn't solve, which was around who had sang a song that was sort of in the back of my mind, but I didn't remember what the song name was called. And this was several years ago. And instead of going to Google, I went to ChatGPT and I just kind of described the song. And after two back and forths, it was able to actually give me the song name. That experience is just tremendous. But that experience is great for a very particular reason, and that's because it's doing what it's really defined to do very well and in a way in which I can actively engage and get the results I want pretty much instantaneously. There are other scenarios that I think are trying to do the same thing and leverage LLMs that are just failing in many different fronts because they either A, don't have that great experience of that back and forth in the way that it needs to be, or B, they try to drive you into a certain experience in that back and forth. I'll talk about that in a second. But then also, perhaps they're just trying to leverage the wrong technology for the specific space. And I want to sort of clarify that through 2 points. Let me talk about now Apple Intelligence, which is now available on, if you have the 15 Pro, which I do, and 18.1 iOS. I have a good opportunity to leverage a lot of Apple's own implementation of AI. I think it's out on all of the 16 as well, the iPhone 16s. One of the best implementations of AI that I have seen implemented at all, especially those that are using LLMs, is Apple's use of notification summaries, which is probably the most effective solution for just leveraging AI, but not making you feel like you're having to incorporate AI on your own. If you get 5 Slack messages and they come in as notifications, you don't have to review 5 different notifications. It just summarizes all of it into one simple notification saying, here's your status update, right? Now, it's certainly not great at collecting sarcasm, but it is phenomenal for perhaps when your mother texts you that long message again, and it just summarizes distinctly the key points so you know if it's necessary to look at now and respond now, or if you need to look at later. And the thing I love about it is that I don't have to ask it to summarize my notifications for me. It's just done. And it makes it so much more effective to actually leverage AI in that sense where I'm not having to ask it, I'm not having to pull on it, it's just happening for me organically. And that is what I think makes it a great user experience in that sense. And the difference between that user experience and ChatGPT, which is a sort of a pull method, is twofold. One, with ChatGPT, it's a method where I am having a sort of organic question on my own that no system outwardly could understand that I would have at that present moment, or I have a specific task that I have just been assigned and need to leverage it for. And in that sense, what I am not expecting is something to automatically be done, but rather instead a solution that can help me get there faster. And so when I look at things like notifications, if I had to go through and ask for that to be summarized, that's something that the system already knows about and could do for me on my own, but instead would just sort of be this blocker in the way. With ChatGPT, that's not the case, but having a great model and a great sort of understanding makes it still an enjoyable experience. I bring those 2 points up because I want to point as well to a bad example of AI, also with Apple Intelligence, which is its rewriting implementation. Like every solution out there, Apple leverages the ability to rewrite words for you that you've written already. And while it's fine, it does an okay job. There's nothing spectacular about it, certainly not relative to the other models you currently see out there in LLMs. And since it's just fine, what it ultimately causes is, first off, you have to highlight all the text, then you have to select writing tools, then you have to define what type you want to do, and then it's going to show it, and then you have to decide whether you want to keep it or not. It's just a lot of work to the point where it feels like I'd rather not even have to go through that process in the first place. Unless if something is truly specific, very important. And in the case in which it's very important that I need to summarize this very distinctly, I'm not going to use Apple's LLM approach because it's simply not the best. If I truly need to create an email and make it sound more professional, I'm not going to rely on Apple's LLM. It's an on-device processing model solution. It's not going to be the most powerful and it's not going to be the best. So if I actually need that, I'm not going to use Apple's implementation. And if I don't actually need it, if it is not important enough to actually require the best model for it, then I'm just simply not going to use it in the first place. And in this situation where perhaps there was this middle ground where I could use it, but not going to force it, Apple makes it a pretty bad experience to get there, where you have to, again, highlight multiple things, select writing tools, instead of having like a one button press that'll just take care of it for you and have defaults set for you and have like your voice and understanding. It instead just takes a long process to actually make happen. And that's a bad example, I think, of AI. Another bad example is if you have had the unfortunate opportunity to use Slack AI, which was, and I'd say this as kindly as I can, one of the more disappointing implementations of AI. Slack AI was probably a great example of a good concept in theory that just did not work well at all. Slack AI sort of would take all of the notes and thoughts that have been written in Slack threads that are public or ones you've used or private, and you could just ask questions to it. And the theory was that it would spit out proper results, proper answers. And the problem being, one, you never knew what would actually trigger Slack AI. It wasn't clear understanding. It was sort of, you had to phrase a specific question a specific way in order to trigger it. If you did trigger it, it was pretty dreadful of an implementation, not good. And in the event in which you were getting a response back, it could oftentimes just point you in the wrong direction or tell you couldn't find anything. And ultimately, what this leads to is just a bad experience where you don't want to use AI. And it feels like an implementation that had so much potential when you think about indexing Slacks and all the knowledge in Slack into an LLM, and it should be a wonderful overlap. And instead, what you got was just a really poor mismatch of different responses and wrong answers. You can kind of think the same about, Figma's AI, which has had some really good spots. Unfortunately, some of their bad spots were really highlighted with their weather app, which ultimately was very clearly just copied off of iOS. And every implementation where you tried to generate sort of a weather app, it would just be iOS's weather app a little bit differently. Another sort of scenario where you have, again, perhaps bad inputs or just a bad model, and ultimately is not able to define and build a great solution for you. And these examples are trying to force fit AI in a space where perhaps it's not ready, or perhaps ultimately just builds a worse experience as a whole. Now suddenly my Slack message, Slack searching is clogged up with a AI that may or may not appear and may or may not work. And if it does actually work, I don't know if I can actually trust it as well. And the same thing with Figma. If you're trying to generate a concept of a plan, your design in that scenario may or may not work well and may be actually sort of copyrighted almost off of another implementation. These types of scenarios, I think, really drive it. And, again, a comment out to Figma for actually pulling their AI in that scenario and making tweaks to it. But these kind of solutions are just not great. And what it ultimately comes down to is not everything needs AI. And certainly not everything can be solved by a large language model. And I think that's what most people need to understand. That the best implementations of AI that we've seen before LLMs before ChatGPT weren't LLMs in many cases. They were based off of lots of different approaches to, just sort of neural networks and classifications. And these types of approaches, while, perhaps not as, clearly AI forward, were great. They're the types of AI solutions that you think of on your Google Photos, where all of your friends are able to be grouped into their specific profile, and you can say, hey, that's that person. It'll show you all the pictures of them, and that's AI, but it's not AI forward. That's just using standard sort of classification techniques to look at how the image is processed ultimately, and then defining who this is most likely to be. And that type of approach, I think, drove a ton of value, but people didn't look at that and say, wow, AI is so incredible, because it wasn't AI forward. It was instead just a great experience that was being positioned. And that's what needs to, I think, come back to. If you want to have a great AI implementation, you need to first start by understanding that not everything needs AI, and not everything can be solved by a large language model. That's a simple fact. Large language models can only do so much. They are very powerful. They're incredibly powerful, but they are also hitting certain limitations. And now you're having to look into sort of different techniques and chain of thought prompting with which has been around for a bit now, but that's really what OM01 Preview is pushing at for ChatGPT. These sort of approaches try to get around some of the limitations of LLMs, but ultimately it's about understanding where LLMs really work really well and where they don't. And when you're thinking about that, I think you have to start by understanding that AI and large language models, they're simply a new medium. They're a new surface that you can build on. They're not the end product. They're not this end goal. And really, it comes back to that initial point I made, which is like, why are you building and using AI? If you are building a solution and are saying, hey, how can we incorporate artificial intelligence? You're going the wrong direction, fundamentally. Again, if you're a pre-seed or looking for funding, there's always that case where, okay, maybe you need to have it just to have that word in there and raise funding. Understood. But if you're trying to build it by definition of, hey, I just want to incorporate something AI, these are powerful tools, how can we use it? That's oftentimes the wrong thought process. What instead you should be thinking about is incorporating AI as a new medium for you. And what are your ideas for what is the biggest problems that your customers are facing today? And if you come across your top level problems and you discover, hey, previously this problem couldn't be solved, but now we maybe can solve it with artificial intelligence or a large language model or leveraging, an image generation solution or a multimodal solution. If that is the medium by which you actually solve it, that's great. And that's a great implementation of AI. But if you start by saying, hey, we just got access to, a lot of new opportunities within, perhaps the Vertex AI for Google, and now we want to try to incorporate it, you're approaching it from the wrong direction. You're trying to build and create things that ultimately users may or may not want and probably don't actually need. And when I think about new mediums, I like to go back to when smartwatches first came out, a brand new medium for engagement. And in some ways, entertainment, in many ways, new information. And if you look at those initial smartwatches, it's interesting some of the approaches that those early companies took. A lot of them actually started moving into the space of including like cameras on your smartwatch. And many of them looked at, again, force fitting to a circular look so that you could, have the old look as well, and trying to make that sort of this new approach that it looked like a watch that you were familiar with. And many of them were looking at different ways to sort of include more increased speaker approaches and all these sort of different solutions. And really what it ultimately led to was just like a poor experience as a whole, because people were looking at this and saying, how can we add something to this watch? Rather than saying, this smartwatch is a new medium, and if we have a problem, we must now incorporate that medium as a baseline for our new solutioning. And when you think about how those problems came to be and ultimately how those solutions were devised as well, you can think again at what has made the Apple Watch great in many different ways. And of course, great experience, beautiful pairing, but it's always been about for them sensors and activity tracking. And that has always been the core of what it has been. And instead of force fitting it to this circular approach that would, make it look like a watch of standard, they said, no, we're instead going to go in a direction that builds the best experience for the platform, solving the right problems that can exist on this platform. And that's why you see that instead of having these, new, again, things that old that were like cameras and these sort of expanded band pieces and some of these things that had large, massive screens or circular screens, instead they just built the best experience because it was a new medium, a new surface. And that's really how you need to think about AI in this case, where these solutions have become this new medium. When you think of ChatGPT, for example, it's really a new surface for work execution. When I have a problem and I need to solve it, I can think about either A, trying to use a previous template I've done in the past. I can B, look at just starting from scratch. I can C, in the past, maybe it was more about dictation, but now I have ChatGPT, especially with its advanced voice mode, which is a great medium for solving these problems. Not because I'm trying to say, hey, I want to use ChatGPT for this. It's instead, this is probably the best approach to actually do it. And that's what's making it a great product solution there. But if I instead had said, hey, ChatGPT, I want to use this tool, I'm going to force fit it. And goodness knows I have tried. What you ultimately come up with is it's not the best solution. In that specific example, ChatGPT, or OpenAI rather, released their GPTs, where you can sort of create GPTs for others to use. And I tried creating several of them. And ultimately what you get is not a great experience in many ways. Sort of these solutions that just aren't quite smart enough to be where they need to be. And ultimately, you're trying to force yourself to use that custom GPT, but it's not able to really get to where you need it to be. And then you're sort of going in the wrong direction. And that's a great scenario where I have in the past thought, hey, here's a good tool. Let me see if I can use it. But it's not the right solution. And ultimately, have never continued to use any of the custom GPTs I have built. And so when you're thinking about these solutions and incorporating them into your workflow, I think great AI experiences are ones where the AI is not front and center. In fact, AI is best probably not even mentioned, which isn't possibly what marketing wants. Although I think in many ways, given how much AI whitewashing is going on, could be a good case to be made. But AI experiences are best when AI is just not the front and center aspect, when it powers that great experience, when the results are front and center and AI just runs that system. That's where you get beautiful, phenomenal, tremendous implementations of AI. And perhaps that's an LLM, perhaps it's a image generation, perhaps it's multimodal, perhaps it's something with voice, perhaps it's something that just takes your notifications and summarizes them and gives it to you. And that is a great implementation of AI. As these companies sort of move forward and everyone's sort of talking about, where are we going with artificial intelligence? You're going to come across a lot of scenarios where people just sort of use ChatGPT and it's just like a wrapper for what they're currently doing. In many areas, people say, hey, that's not a real AI company, right? And I disagree. I think using OpenAI or using one of these models and wrapping it with your own custom logic and building a great experience on top of it is a phenomenal AI company, for sure. I think that certainly maybe you're not doing the actual machine learning models. Perhaps you're not actually training these models from scratch. But, we also don't go through and, say that the only way to be a real baker is if you create all your machines and actually grow your own, food as well. No, like you can start with these models and still be a great AI company. But I think if you want to be a phenomenal forward-thinking solution, you can't simply sit on LLMs as the tool. You have to build a great experience. And so whatever you're building out there, the bottom line is this. Don't think about how you can add AI to your product. It's the wrong approach. Instead, really drill down and incorporate these new solutions as part of the bedrock for your ability to solve problems. And if the best solution is leveraging artificial intelligence, great. Go ahead and do it. And perhaps even incorporate the fact that there's AI if that makes sense from a marketing perspective. But don't feel pressured to. And certainly don't look at AI as this panacea that's going to solve all these problems down the stream. Not the right approach. Instead, think about how you can just leverage and incorporate a lot of that great execution into a phenomenal end result and a great product as a whole. And so those are my, again, really simple thoughts. Just keep it focused on experiences. AI is going to come, and I don't believe AI is a sort of flash in the pan. I believe a lot of what we're seeing with these LLMs and more are going to really transform many different industries. And I hope that you find great ways to incorporate it as part of your solutioning. And if you do so, I think there's a lot of power and a lot of great value to be had. And I also certainly believe that if you try to force fit it and say, we're going to use this because we've got to have something AI, it's going to be a real struggle downstream. A little post note as well. I would also say if you are in that position where you have to incorporate AI because you need to get funding, the one thing I would just really encourage you to do is to understand these systems as best you can. Because once you really understand what all these tools can do and what they do really well, when you actually look at your backlog of problems you can solve, you're going to start to understand a little bit better where perhaps you can actually apply some of these solutions, where you can apply some of these LLMs. And in the past, perhaps, you would have sort of said, that's too big of a problem, we can't solve that right now. But going forward, perhaps you'll look at it with a little bit of a different picture because you understand what can be solved and the complexity with which it can be solved as well. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Would love to hear your thoughts. And as always, I hope you have a great one.